Marine hero faces jail for sleeping outside. What the judge did left everyone in tears. An old man, in torn boots and a military jacket 2 sizes too big, stands before a courtroom. His crime? Sleeping near a restaurant vent to survive the cold. No1 looks twice at him, until the judge opens his file, and her hands start to tremble. What happens next? Stunned silence. Recognition. And then, something no one saw coming. A courtroom frozen in time. A name whispered that hadn't been spoken in decades. And finally, a moment that brought everyone to their feet, with tears in their eyes. Stay with us. This is not just a trial. It's a reckoning. Welcome back to Cracks of Light, where true stories shine through the darkest corners of life. If you believe even forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, then you're in the right place. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling the stories that matter most. The man shuffled into the courtroom with the weight of decades pressing down on his spine. Wrists bound in cold steel cuffs, shoulders hunched beneath a faded military coat, at least 2 sizes too large. His steps echoed like a slow metronome through the silence. No one in the gallery looked twice. Just another homeless old man. Just another petty case. The bailiff called out the docket number with the same disinterest, as if announcing the next order at a lunch counter. Case 19A, City of Greenville versus Julian Ward. The name registered no reaction, except for the slight flinch in the corner of the room where Judge Alexandra Boone sat behind the bench, flipping through the file without looking up. Her eyes froze mid-page. The name clawed at a memory she had buried years ago. She blinked once, forced her face to remain neutral, and nodded for the hearing to proceed. Julian didn't raise his head. He didn't need to. He'd been through this process before. Same script, different courtroom, always the same outcome. The prosecutor, a young man in a pristine navy suit and an eager voice, rose with notes in hand. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended at 11:38 p.m. behind the rear service door of the Red Lantern Cafe. He refused to comply with orders to vacate the premises. This marks his 3rd citation in as many months for trespassing and loitering. Julian said nothing. He barely moved. The judge glanced at him. Mr. Ward, do you have representation today? He cleared his throat slowly. Public defender was pulled to another court. I can speak for myself. Go ahead. His voice cracked, but held. Didn't mean no harm. Just needed 5 minutes. Sandwich ain't gonna warm itself. The prosecutor cut in. He's been warned before. Business owners have made repeated complaints. He creates an unsafe impression for customers. Judge Boone looked up. Unsafe impression? Her tone was flat. The prosecutor hesitated. Your Honor, it's a pattern. This isn't about a sandwich. It's about boundaries. She looked down again at the file. Her fingers hesitated at the words former U.S. Marine Corps. A notation scribbled in the margin caught her eye. Staff Sergeant. Discharged 1998. Her chest tightened. She pushed the thought aside. Focus. Objectivity. Julian's hands remained folded in his lap. His fingernails were dark with grit. No wedding ring. No family sitting behind him. Just a coat too big and eyes that had seen too much to care anymore. Why that cafe? She asked. Vent leaks heat. Julian replied simply. Cold gets worse after midnight. You could have gone to the shelter. Closed early. Too many already there. They only got 12 beds. And your military service? She asked, despite herself. Marines. 2nd Battalion, 8th Regiment. 76 to 98. You served in Fallujah? That name shouldn't have slipped. But it did. Julian's eyes flicked up for the first time. There was something sharper behind them. Yeah, he said. Twice. The judge closed the file, slowly. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. The air in the room shifted, though no one else noticed. We recommend community service and a restraining order barring Mr. Ward from the downtown business district, the prosecutor added. Julian nodded once. If that's what it takes. He didn't plead. He didn't explain. Alexandra tapped her fingers lightly on the edge of the bench, eyes still on him, mind somewhere far away. The name Julian Ward. She had seen it before. Not in a courtroom. Not in a file. But in a letter. A long time ago. A letter stained with desert dust and grief. She looked at the man again. His posture, though slouched, held remnants of discipline. His silence wasn't defeat. It was the practiced restraint of someone trained to endure. Her memory pulled up a face, younger, sharper, arms steady under a wounded body. Her brother's body. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The bailiff called the next procedural step, breaking her thought. Julian remained still. Is there anyone here on your behalf? The judge asked. No, ma'am. I don't expect anyone. His voice was dry, almost apologetic. She nodded slowly. We'll recess for 10 minutes. The gavel came down, but the noise of it felt distant. Julian didn't move, didn't ask questions. He just waited. That's what he'd always done. Waited for the weather to warm, for the noise to fade, for someone to remember. And now, for some reason he couldn't understand, someone just had. Alexandra Boone closed the courtroom door behind her and leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary. Her chambers were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made memories louder. She moved toward her desk, not to work, but to find something she hadn't touched in years. The old drawer stuck slightly before sliding open, revealing a faded file folder tucked beneath a stack of sealed case notes. Inside it, brittle with time, was a letter. Yellowed paper, frayed edges. Her brother's handwriting slanted but clear. Nathan Boone, First Lieutenant, USMC, Kia, Fallujah, Iraq. She sat down slowly, as if the air had thickened. The courtroom name had jolted her. But this was confirmation of something she hadn't even known she was waiting for. She unfolded the letter with care, scanning the familiar lines. He'd written it just days before his death. He had mentioned a staff sergeant by name. Ward. Said the man had pulled him out from a kill zone when half their convoy had been pinned. If I don't make it back, Nathan wrote, tell Mom and Dad it wasn't because no one tried. Staff Sergeant Julian Ward damn near carried me through hell. That name. She hadn't read it in so long. She'd read the rest of the letter dozens of times. During the funeral, the weeks that followed, when her parents stopped talking and started aging twice as fast. But the name hadn't meant anything back then. Just a line. Just a man they could never find. She pulled up Julian's court file again and looked harder. Marine Corps. Staff Sergeant. Dates aligned. Deployment matched. The photos stapled to the back. He was older now, weathered, but the eyes were unmistakable. She felt her throat tighten. Could it really be him? Her heart said yes. Her mind said don't go there. But the lines kept matching. Fallujah. 2004. 2nd Battalion. 8th Marines. The same unit. The same mission. And the same man, now sleeping behind restaurants and being charged for survival. She rubbed her temple and stared at the photo. He didn't recognize her in court. Of course he didn't. She had married after law school, changed her name, built a new life wrapped in law books and robes and authority. But she remembered him. Not his face, but his name. The way Nathan had spoken about him. Not like a soldier, like a legend. And now, that same man was sitting in her courtroom, quiet, tired, with no one left to speak for him. She opened another drawer and retrieved a smaller envelope. Inside it was the last photo taken of Nathan in uniform. He stood beside a group of Marines, arms across shoulders, all grinning. The quality was grainy, but the man on the far left looked like a younger version of the one who'd stood in cuffs earlier that day. She looked from the photo to the court file. Her hand trembled, but she forced herself to stay composed. If this was him, if Julian Ward was the man from her brother's letter, then he had saved Nathan once, bought her family 2 more weeks, and now he was on trial for sitting near a heat vent. Her breath caught. Something in her shifted. Not pity, not guilt, something deeper, a responsibility. She rose and walked to the mirror above her bookshelf, stared at herself. A judge, a daughter, a sister. She'd spent 20 years honoring the law, but in this moment, the law wasn't enough. It didn't see what she saw. It didn't remember what she remembered. It didn't know what she owed. She sat back down, pulled open Julian's full service record, and began combing through the military databases. Most of it was still redacted, portions sealed under classifications she couldn't crack without authorization, but there were enough scraps to form a picture. His silver star, his injuries, his years served, and his disappearance from the system. The trail went dark around 2008. Then nothing, like he had vanished. No benefits, no contact, just a name that faded from every list. She wondered how many others had gone the same way. How many names like Julian Ward were still out there, forgotten until someone had them arrested for trying not to freeze. The thought made her stomach turn. The knock on her door was soft. It was her clerk. Your Honor? Court's set to resume in 10. She nodded without answering, then looked back down at the folder. Julian Ward, Staff Sergeant. Hero once. Homeless now. A man who had saved her brother's life without knowing the girl he saved him for was now holding the gavel. She closed the folder gently and stood, her spine straightened by habit, but her heart felt uneven. There were rules, boundaries. She knew them, but there were also truths too sacred to ignore. She took one last look at the photo of Nathan, young and full of fire, and whispered, "I think I found him, Nate." Then she walked back toward the courtroom, not as a judge seeking order, but as a sister searching for closure. The courtroom door opened with a click that cut through the murmurs. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped forward, briefcase in hand, walking straight to the defense table like he belonged there. Judge Alexandra Boone looked up, eyebrows tightening slightly. The man adjusted his tie, looked toward her bench with composure, and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, my name is David Chun. I've just been retained as counsel for Mr. Ward." Julian didn't move, only turned his head slightly, confused. He hadn't called a lawyer. He hadn't called anyone. The judge narrowed her eyes. "Mr. Chun, this court wasn't notified of your representation. I understand, Your Honor. It was a last-minute arrangement. But I'd like to formally enter my appearance and request a short recess to confer with my client." She studied him, then nodded once. 15 minutes. Don't waste them." The gavel fell. David leaned over to Julian, voice low. "I'm not here by accident. And you don't owe me a cent." Julian's eyes stayed on the floor. "I didn't ask for help. I know. But I did," David said. "For a long time." In the back corridor, David spoke first. "You probably don't remember me, but I knew your name before today." Julian gave him a sideways look. "How?" David hesitated. "My older brother served under you. In Iraq. He never came home. But his letters did. He wrote about you. A sergeant who didn't care about medals, just getting his men back alive. He said if things ever went bad, you'd be the one to carry someone out. Said you did it for 3 different guys in 1 week." Julian remained quiet. "I started looking you up after I graduated law school. Your name was buried. In paperwork. In medical records. Nothing added up. Silver Star, multiple deployments, honorable discharge, then gone. No benefits. No follow-up. Like you dropped off the grid." Julian said quietly, "I did." David nodded. "I figured that out too. I also know your file shows multiple untreated injuries, traumatic brain injury, and PTSD. You got shuffled between VA hospitals. Denied housing because of missing documentation. Your wife left during your 3rd tour. You came back and nothing made sense anymore." Julian looked down. "Don't want pity." "Not offering any," David said. "Just facts. The system failed you. I can't fix the past, but I'm not letting it bury you now." Alexandra watched from her chamber's window, hearing only fragments. But David's presence stirred something in her. She hadn't seen him in years, not since her husband's funeral. Thomas had always said David would do good work. He'd been right. When the recess ended, they re-entered. Julian sat straighter now, still worn down, but no longer alone. David stood next to him, shoulders squared. Alexandra adjusted her glasses slowly. "Mr. Chun, you may proceed." David's voice was steady. "Your Honor, my client's history has bearing on the charges brought against him. While it's true he was behind the cafe after hours, it's also true that staff regularly offered him leftover food and didn't treat him as a trespasser. He was not loitering with intent, but seeking warmth in a public alley where he had a standing understanding with one of the employees." The prosecutor opened his mouth, but David raised a hand. "Furthermore, Mr. Ward is a decorated combat veteran. His service record includes engagements in multiple theaters, including the Battle of Fallujah, where he was injured pulling fellow Marines out under fire. These are not hypotheticals, Your Honor. These are actions for which he was awarded the Silver Star. And he never once used them as a shield for his current situation." Alexandra looked at Julian. "Is this true?" He nodded once. "Did my job. That's all." David continued. "He returned home with injuries that were never properly addressed. His benefits were delayed for years due to administrative errors and a lost discharge packet. He worked construction until his back gave out. He applied for help. He waited. Nothing came. He lost his apartment. And still, he never asked for handouts. Just sat quietly outside a place that didn't kick him out. Until now." Alexandra leaned back slightly, hands folded. "And you're representing him pro bono?" David nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And not just today. My firm will handle his appeal for full benefits. We've already submitted preliminary documentation to the VA on his behalf." The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor had lost his edge. Julian's eyes stayed forward, not meeting anyone's. He didn't like being spoken for, but he wasn't sure how to fight anymore. David glanced down at him, then back to the bench. "My client didn't come here asking for redemption, but he deserves justice and dignity." Alexandra looked down at the file again. There were details she hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't known how to interpret. Now they felt sharper, like a puzzle snapping into place. She closed the folder slowly, then spoke with a tone even and deliberate. "This court will review the full service record and consider all relevant context. In the meantime, Mr. Ward will remain in the city's veteran shelter under temporary release. Further proceedings are stayed until proper representation is confirmed and documentation from the VA is received." The gavel struck wood again. The courtroom didn't move. David touched Julian's shoulder lightly. "This is just the beginning. But you're not invisible anymore." Julian didn't speak. He just nodded once, and for the first time in years, it meant something. The courtroom was quiet, but not still. There was tension humming beneath the surface, something unsaid, something waiting. The judge sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the man before her. Julian Ward stood beside his attorney, shoulders straight despite the weight pressing down from years no one in that room could fully understand. The silence broke when the gallery door opened. A man in a Marine League jacket walked in, silver hair, a limp that told its own story. He didn't sit. He just stood near the back, eyes locked on Julian. "That's him," the man said, voice steady, just loud enough to carry. "That's Staff Sergeant Ward. I was there." Heads turned. The prosecutor started to object, but Judge Boone lifted a hand, silencing him. The man continued. "Fallujah, 2004, my unit got caught in a kill zone. Mortars were coming in fast. We were pinned. And then Ward came through the smoke like a ghost, dragging our lieutenant on his back. Took 2 hits and didn't stop." Julian didn't respond. His jaw tightened, his hands locked behind his back. "He saved 6 of us," the man added, "including me." The courtroom was frozen. Judge Boone turned to Julian. "Is that true?" Julian exhaled slowly. "I don't count. Just did what I was trained to do." David Chin glanced at him, then nodded to the judge. "With permission, Your Honor, I'd like to allow Mr. Ward to speak freely. No prompts. No filters." She agreed. Julian stepped forward slightly. He didn't raise his voice. "April 17th, he said quietly. "We were escorting a convoy outside Fallujah. Dust everywhere. One of the lead Humvees hit an IED. We got hit from both sides. Ambush." His voice remained level, but something in his eyes changed. Lieutenant Nathan Boone was on the ground. Took shrapnel to the leg and was pinned under debris. Medic went down trying to reach him. I ran through the fire line and got him out. The room seemed to tighten around that name. Alexandra Boone didn't move. We made it to the evac point. I put him on the chopper. He was still conscious. Kept yelling at me to go back, help the others. Told me to leave him behind. I didn't. He paused. He made it out. For a while, anyway. The older Marine in the gallery spoke again. He bought us time. Held the perimeter. Ordered the counterfire. Half that convoy walked away because of him. Judge Boone stood slowly. "Lieutenant Nathan Boone," she said. "That was my brother." The gasp moved like a wave through the courtroom. Julian looked at her, the recognition slow but dawning. She nodded. "He wrote to us about a sergeant who carried him through hell. Called him a ghost. Said if he ever made it home, it was because of you." Julian's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. He swallowed hard. She stepped down from the bench, something rare and unscripted in her every motion. "At his funeral, men came up to my family. One of them said, 'Your son saved my life.' But he only made it because of the man who carried him out. I never forgot that. I just never knew your name until now." The doors opened again. 3 Marines in dress uniforms walked in, silent and precise. One carried a polished wooden box. The lead stepped forward and saluted. "Staff Sergeant Julian Ward," he began. "On behalf of the Secretary of the Navy and the United States Marine Corps, I am here to correct an oversight. After extensive review under the Veterans Reconsideration Initiative, your Silver Star has been formally upgraded." The box was opened. Inside, on blue velvet, lay the Navy Cross. A low murmur spread across the room. The second highest award for valor in combat. The colonel continued. Your actions on April 17th didn't just save Lieutenant Boone and several Marines. You disrupted a coordinated ambush and prevented the destruction of the entire convoy. Julian stared at the medal. There must be some mistake, he said quietly. I didn't do anything special. The colonel shook his head. No mistake, Sergeant. Just delayed recognition. Far too delayed. The courtroom rose, one by one. Veterans, spectators, even the prosecutor. They stood not out of protocol, but something older than that. Respect. David Chin placed a hand on Julian's back, steadying him as he trembled. Judge Boone's voice cracked slightly. In light of these revelations, all charges against Staff Sergeant Ward are hereby dismissed. Permanently. The gavel dropped. This time, it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a beginning. Julian didn't cry, but his eyes shimmered as the corporal handed him the medal. He looked at it for a long moment, then whispered, more to himself than anyone else. I thought they forgot. From the back of the room, the old Marine answered, We didn't. We never did. Alexandra held the letter with both hands, careful not to crease the paper more than time already had. Her voice was steady as she began to read, though every word carried weight. April 18th. We made it through yesterday, barely. I thought I was going to die in the sand. Thought I was done. But he didn't let me. She paused, swallowed. A staff sergeant, Ward. He came back for me. Through everything. Gunfire, shrapnel, smoke so thick I couldn't breathe. I told him to leave me. He didn't listen. Said something like, no one gets left behind. Not on my watch. Then he hauled me out like it was nothing. She glanced at Julian. He didn't look at her, just stared down at the floor, fingers laced tightly. She continued. He stayed with me until the bird came. He covered us when the rest of the squad fell back. He didn't blink. If I ever make it out of this, it's because of him. Her voice cracked. He deserves everything. I hope the Corps doesn't forget him. She lowered the letter slowly. They did, Julian said quietly. They forgot me. His voice wasn't angry, just hollow. I got off the plane 6 months later with a limp, a migraine that wouldn't stop, and a medal I couldn't eat. My wife was gone. The bank sold the house. The VA sent me a list of phone numbers, and none of them worked. I drank for a while. Then I just stopped talking to people. I figured it was easier that way. Alexander said nothing, waiting. I thought maybe I'd see him again, Julian continued. Your brother. Even after they said he didn't make it. I kept thinking maybe the reports were wrong. Maybe it was another convoy. Another lieutenant. He shook his head. But it was him. She nodded. It was. Then I thought, maybe I shouldn't have gone back for him. Maybe if I'd focused on the team, more would have made it. Maybe saving him just bought him 2 more weeks to die somewhere else. I carried that for a long time. Alexandra stepped closer. But those 2 weeks mattered. You gave us time to say goodbye. You gave him time to write this letter. You gave him a chance to be remembered. Julian's hands tightened. Sometimes it felt like I made it worse. You didn't, she said firmly. You gave him something we never would have had otherwise. That day, you were his shield. His family's hope. You were the reason we could bury him with honor and not with questions. Julian nodded slowly, but the shame didn't fully leave his face. You said he wrote that line? Alexandra asked. About no one being left behind? Julian looked up. Yeah, that's what we said. In the unit. Especially in Fallujah. We lived by it. She gestured to the courtroom outside. You said it. You lived it. And now, 20 years later, someone finally said it back to you. He didn't answer, but his eyes welled. She placed the letter on the desk beside him. I've read this so many times, I know every word. But hearing it today, knowing you're the man he wrote about, it changes everything. Julian exhaled, slow and deep. I just wanted to disappear. But you didn't, she said. You walked back into the world. Even if it was through the side door of a cafe in the freezing dark. You came back. And when you did, we stood up for you. That matters. Julian looked toward the window, blinked once. I didn't think anyone remembered my name. Alexandra smiled faintly. He did. And now, so do we. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. Of things never said. Of grief acknowledged. Of burdens finally shared. And for the first time in decades, Julian Ward stood without apology. Julian stood outside the apartment door longer than necessary. His hand hovered over the knob like he wasn't sure if it would open, like it was a dream that might vanish if he touched it. The housing officer gave a quiet nod behind him, but Julian didn't turn. Finally, he stepped inside. It was simple, quiet. 2 rooms. A bed already made. A small kitchenette. Nothing fancy, but everything real. He didn't speak. Just walked slowly toward the table where a folder lay waiting. Documents, keys, a letter from the VA confirming full benefits reinstated, 100% service-connected disability, and a retroactive payment. There was also a second folder, courtesy of David Chun, who had tracked down a storage unit in Nebraska, sold off years ago. Inside were copies of discharge papers, medical evaluations, and a list of service medals once lost in bureaucratic limbo. Every one of them had been recovered. Some physically, some through official reissuance. But they were all there now. The Navy Cross, the Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, a combat action ribbon, and the folded American flag he hadn't seen since the day he left the Corps. A display case had been mounted on the wall above the small couch. The medals were already inside, laid against black velvet. He stared at them for a long time. He didn't reach for them. He just looked. The silence wasn't heavy like before. It wasn't the kind that pressed in. It was the kind that gave space to breathe. That night, he sat on the edge of the bed for a while, unsure if he should take off his boots. He hadn't had a bed in years. Just mats, benches, concrete. He finally unlaced them and set them by the door. When he lay down, the mattress didn't creak. It didn't sag. It just held him. He stared at the ceiling, eyes open in the dark. He didn't cry, but his chest felt tight in a way that wasn't pain. It was release. Morning came without cold. For the first time in over 2 decades, Julian didn't wake up shivering. He didn't wake up wondering if someone would tell him to move, or if rain had soaked through his coat. He woke up warm. He shaved, slowly, with a razor that didn't feel like borrowed time. He pulled on clean clothes, new, donated by a veteran support group David had contacted. And when he stepped outside to the porch of the small complex built for former soldiers, a man in a wheelchair nodded at him from across the lot. No words, just a nod. Recognition. Belonging. Julian nodded back. Later that week, the caseworker from the VA came to walk him through the paperwork. Medical coverage, housing security, counseling, monthly support, education credits he could transfer to a dependent, though he had none. He asked her if he could donate them. She said she'd find out. He didn't ask for much else. Didn't want attention. But he agreed when a group from a local high school invited him to speak. Just once. About service, about duty. He didn't tell them war stories. Just told them about the cost of forgetting. About how sometimes the real battle starts after you come home. He didn't need applause. He just wanted the silence afterward. A few weeks later, Alexandra Boone visited. Not as a judge. Not even in court attire. Just herself. She brought coffee. A simple gesture. They sat at the table near the medals. She didn't bring up Nathan right away. But Julian did. He was better than he thought he was, Julian said. Smart. Brave. He could have made it all the way if the road had been longer. Alexandra nodded. You gave us the last pages of his story. We would have had nothing without them. He looked at the case on the wall. I thought I didn't need any of that anymore. Maybe you didn't, she said. But you deserved it. The medal didn't change him. The housing didn't erase the years on the street. But something in Julian began to settle. The questions that had looped in his mind for decades had answers now. Imperfect, maybe, but real. He spent his days simply. Reading, walking, sometimes sitting with other vets who didn't want to talk, but liked to not be alone. He learned their names. They learned his. And little by little, he began to matter again. One morning, as he stood shaving, he caught his own reflection and didn't look away. He studied his face the way one studies a map. Lines drawn from time and scars, from victories and losses. He touched the edge of his jaw, the gray in his beard, the crease beneath his eye. Then he said it out loud, just to see how it felt. Julian Ward. Not a number. Not a burden. Not a ghost. A name. Remembered. Respected. Still here. Julian opened the door before she knocked. He must have heard her footsteps on the path, or maybe he just knew she'd come. Alexandra smiled, holding the same small wooden box she had carried into the courtroom weeks earlier, but now with something personal inside. A folded photograph of Nathan, a note in his handwriting, and a copy of the citation for the Navy Cross. They sat by the window, no robes, no bench, no gavel, just a Marine's sister and the man who had once carried him out of fire. Julian looked older today, not in the way age wears a man down, but in the way someone feels settled after years of drifting. He opened the box slowly, lifted the letter Nathan had written, and held it between his hands like it was something alive. Alexandra didn't speak. She let him take his time. His eyes scanned the words for what must have been the 1000th time, but this time, he read them aloud. His voice didn't shake the way it had in court. It was firmer now, grounded. When he reached the part where Nathan called him, the man I'd follow anywhere, Julian paused, stared down at the ink, and tears welled without shame. I carried him out, he said, voice low. But he carried me too, longer than he ever knew. Alexandra placed a hand over his. He'd be proud. Of both of you. Julian nodded, brushing his cheek with the back of his sleeve. I used to think I failed him, that I just delayed the end. But now I know, those days mattered. The letter, the time, what he gave your family. That wasn't nothing. She leaned forward. It wasn't. It gave us closure. It gave us peace. And you, she looked him in the eyes, you gave that back to all of us. They sat in silence for a while after that, letting the weight of memory settle in the room like something sacred. As she stood to leave, Alexandra turned to him. Today, she said, we kept the promise he made. No one left behind. Julian followed her to the door. She didn't offer goodbye. Just one last look that said everything that needed to be said. He stood alone after she left, facing the display case on the wall. The Navy Cross gleamed softly in the morning light. Beneath it, the medals he'd once believed lost forever. But it wasn't the hardware that held him in place. It was the name. His name. Framed, official, honored. Julian Ward. Not a ghost. Not forgotten. He stepped closer, ran a hand along the glass. Someone remembered, he whispered. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Not for himself, but for every soul who had ever wondered if sacrifice faded when the world moved on. And now, for the first time in 20 years, Julian smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer owned him. If this story moved you, if you believe that every name deserves to be remembered, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Cracks of Light. Let's keep telling the stories that remind us who we are, and who we must never forget.